There's a saying that goes around, which is a quotation from Oscar Wilde's play, The Woman of No Importance. And it goes that saints are people with a past and sinners are people with a future. And like many of Oscar Wilde's little phrases that are easy to remember, it sometimes can get misused, I think, or misappropriated. It gets turned into key rings and postcards and things like that, which in some sense, perhaps in modern culture, glorifies sin. We read it in the context of the play in which it is meant to be a moment to reflect on something that is important. What we want to think about, what's at the center of the phrase in the play, is that sinners are not to be condemned and saints are not to be declared too early. So when we see that phrase being misused, it's important to think about it. Patrick, who we celebrate today, is somebody about whom we say a lot, but know, in fact, very little. And the easiest title for Patrick, to use it as Gaelica, Ospel Morna Heron, the principal apostle of Ireland. And in the tradition of the Irish Church, while he's considered to be the principal evangelizer of Ireland, or the most significant, and has the patronage of the country, he is by no means the only person who preached the faith in Ireland, even at the time that he's supposed to have been there. There were many missionaries sent to Ireland, and the Patrick that we're trying to celebrate today and trying to remember today is the one who had the greatest success. And who is he? I know that every year on St. Patrick's Day, people love to remind those of us who grew up in the Emerald Isle that Patrick was not an Irishman. And nobody, I think, in Ireland believes that he was indeed an Irishman, at least nobody who's reflected on his life for any length of time. Well, I know that there are some people who will want to tell us that he's Welsh. There are other people who want to tell us that he's from Scotland. But actually, if we look at his confession, he tells us that he's from a little Roman town, and if the Google search is to be relied upon, that Roman town no longer exists, and it's somewhere underneath a flyover, somewhere near an exit to Northampton. So that's how close we are here to that little bit of history. Those of us who've had the benefit of any kind of Dominican education or formation in Ireland will know one thing for certain, which is that he arrived to continue his mission, or to commence his mission in Ireland, in the year 432. Nice and easy to remember, because it's the same year that the Basilica of Santa Sabina in Rome was erected. A long time indeed before our Holy Father St. Dominic arrived there. But that year, 432, is a central year. There's a dispute over when Patrick was born, and indeed over where he died, when he died. But that year, 432, is in the hearts and minds of many an Irish lad and lass as the year that we learned in school that Patrick arrived in Ireland. And much ink indeed has been spilled about that particular fact and whether it's true and everything that goes around it. I think one of the things that we can do usefully is to reflect on Patrick in terms of what he says of himself. There are two things that he has: the confession, or the testimony, which is very often called by the confession, its Latin title, and another epistola, a letter that he wrote to some soldiers. But it's the confessions I'd like to think about today, because it begins with that beautiful phrase, I am Patrick, a sinner. And whatever we might say academically or historically, the person who sat down to write that confession began with that wonderful and freeing phrase, I am Patrick, a sinner. Somebody who indeed wanted to think about his past through the lens of the wonderful things that God allowed him to do, and then through that to focus his ministry. The folly of his sinfulness, he said, as he was growing up just somewhere close to Northampton, if we're to believe him, the folly of his sinfulness, he says, is what ended up in him being taken away into slavery, a foolish young man. And he was taken to Ireland in slavery and spent many years there in isolation. And there he heard the great call to repentance, the great call to turn and change his life around. And in the loneliness and the isolation of his Irish solitude in days of slavery, he discovered the deep love of God. And that grace led him to mission, right in the very middle of the confessions, right in the very central of the confessions. He says that once he heard the voice of the Lord saying to him very clearly, "He who laid down his life for you, he it is who speaks in you." He who laid down his life for you, he it is who speaks in you. And Patrick had that very beautiful then ministry that was centered around the proclamation of God as Trinity, which is changed and is focused by the first words of the breastplate, Christ in me, Christum, Christ in me, and in which he recognizes the work of Christ in the very heart and mind of his life, expressing how God seeks to come into relationship with us and share his life, share the divine life of the Trinity. And that's what he wanted to share with the people of Ireland, amongst whom he first heard the voice of the Lord speaking to him and inviting him into this new relationship. Truly, what other saint can you think of whose feast day evokes an international celebration and party, which is not always one that is edifying, I understand, but nonetheless is an international party and celebration, and when everybody is supposed to be filled with joy on Patrick's Day? Surely that betrays the outreach of this joyful missionary who, hearing the voice of Christ saying to him, "I who have laid down my life for you, it is I who speak in you and work in you," and the great joy of sharing that relationship and that knowledge with other people. The beauty of the breastplate of Patrick, which reflects on the strong name of the Trinity, reflects on the mystery of Christ's salvation, not just as a story to be told, but as something that makes a difference and unpacks how our sinfulness and our understanding and our recognition of our sinfulness can open to us a brand new life and a whole new way. So for me, I think I want to say it's not so important for us to think who he was, whether he was from Wales or Scotland or Northampton or anywhere else, but what he does and the impact of his ministry, recognizing that in the honesty and humility that's put into his heart, to begin by saying, "I'm Patrick, a sinner." To say, "I met the Lord who said to me, 'He who had laid down his life for you, he it is who speaks in you.'" And then who invited people to join him in saying, to bind unto themselves this day the strong name of the Trinity. So while we can rejoice in Patrick as a saint of the past, we have an opportunity in reflecting on his feast day to look to the future, and to have that in the first moment by once again acknowledging ourselves to be sinners, binding on to ourselves the strong name of the Trinity, And as we continue on our Lenten observance and celebrate with great joy his feast day, focus our lives around the ministry that the Lord has privileged us to share in, one of proclaiming his death and resurrection as the new life and the drama of the love of God being played out before our own eyes.